Hi, everybody. So, we are going to be deep diving into some sentence structure review. To kind of start off, I want to bring our attention to four different terms that hopefully we'll be very familiar with by the end of this video. The first two are clauses. We have a dependent clause and an independent clause. And then the last two are subordinating conjunctions and coordinating conjunctions. If this doesn't make a whole lot of sense to you right now, or if you're like, oh my gosh, I don't know what these mean, do not worry, right? By the end of this video, I hope that we will be a bit more confident in our understanding of these terms. So, to start off with, we're going to look at clauses. And before we get into the specifics of different types of clauses, I want us to know that a clause is just a group of related words that contain a subject and a verb. So, it's just a group of words or a phrase, you could call it. That sometimes is just a part of a sentence, or in some cases, it's even an entire sentence on its own. So, clauses are just a group of related words, right, that have that subject and a verb. And then if we look into the specifics, we have dependent clauses and independent clauses. Before I define each of these, I want us to just use our prior background knowledge and think about what is the difference between dependent and independent, right? A lot of times, if I were to ask, like, oh, what does independent mean? It means that you can do something on your own, you can be on your own, you don't require, other things to help you. Whereas dependent, right, it typically means that you depend on something. You need more in order to be complete. You can't really stand on your own. And that goes true for dependent clauses and independent clauses as well. So dependent clauses, they add information to a sentence, and they're a group of words that are typically important, right? But they cannot be a full-on sentence on their own, right? They cannot stand alone. They depend on further information. They depend on more words. Whereas independent clauses are clauses that have enough information to stand completely on their own. Sometimes independent clauses will have extra information to make an even more complex sentence, but an independent clause on its own could also function as a sentence. So the difference between the two is that dependent clauses, they cannot stand on their own. They require further information to make a complete sentence. And independent clauses, they can stand on their own, and they do not necessarily require further information to make a sentence complete. Here we have some examples of clauses, and I would like for you to identify if they are an independent clause or a dependent clause. So go ahead and read them. The first one is hot air balloons are useless, right? If we believe that this has, the subject and the verb, which it does, and also that it can stand on its own, it doesn't look like it needs further information in order for it to make sense to the reader, the likelihood of it being an independent clause is pretty high. However, if we look at the second one, so when they were invented, we still have that clause, the subject and the verb, but it seems that though this one is missing a little bit of information, and that can be attributed to this first word, when. So when they were invented, it makes it seem like there's further information that is going to follow. So in order for this to be grammatically correct in a sentence on its own, right, when they were invented, there were 3,000 people in the village. Something of that sort, right? It needs to give information and context to when they were invented, because the clause itself, when they were invented, doesn't really make sense to be a complete sentence on its own. Okay, so if we see that difference, right, I went over the first and the second. The first one is an independent, the second one is a dependent, and the difference relies on kind of, is further information required or not? Okay, so once again, I brought our attention to the word when, and this is going to be important when we kind of determine which clauses are independent and which clauses are dependent. And there's an easy way to kind of learn and recognize which clauses are which. So that could be seen when we look at subordinating conjunctions, which we will get to in the following slides. But basically, these are just terms, they're conjunctions, that kind of show that further information is going to be necessary. They kind of trigger extra information to be included in order for a sentence to be grammatically correct. So dependent clauses, they have these subordinating conjunctions, and they require some further information at the end of the sentence in order for it to make sense. So here we have the answers. As I mentioned in the previous slide, we went over the first two, and then the middle two, they're independent, with the following, or with the last one being, although she ran, being dependent. Once again, we have that word, although she ran, right? That kind of would need some further information in order for it to be a sentence that can stand on its own. A way that we could make this dependent clause a sentence that stands on its own, right? We can add some extra information at the end, right? Which would be then a dependent clause, comma, independent clause, which is a sentence structure we'll get to. Right now, I just want us to be able to know that dependent clauses, they are not sentences on their own. They require further information, whereas independent clauses have enough information and they can stand on their own to be a sentence. So I kind of already touched on this, what is a conjunction, but now I really want to kind of understand what exactly a conjunction is and give you a definition. So conjunctions, they are words that link other words, phrases, or clauses together. They allow you to form complex sentences, like I started to explain with the subordinating conjunction, how we could then do a dependent clause, comma, independent clause, and also we have compound sentences we could create. So conjunctions function as, that's funny, the following slide, that'll make sense. Conjunctions kind of function as this connecting piece to make more complex sentences. I giggled at the fact I said conjunction junction because back in the day, this used to be the way that conjunctions were taught. And I'll go ahead and play this so you guys can have some good historical understanding of conjunction function in Schoolhouse Rock.
Conjunction, junction, what's your function? Hooking up words and phrases and clauses. Conjunction, junction, how's that function? I got 3 favorite cars that get most of my job done. Conjunction, junction, what's their function? I got and, but, and or, they'll get you pretty far. And that's an additive like this and that. But that's sort of the opposite. Not this, but that. And then there's or. O-R. When you have a choice like this or that.
All right. I'm going to just stop it there. That's just some good background context. I feel like most adults, they learned conjunctions through Schoolhouse Rock. And I think this is just also a good idea to kind of paint in your guys' head that conjunctions, they are these links, just as for trains, right? They're kind of linking together different things through the carts, right? So a conjunction is one specific cart of a train, right? That kind of can connect 2 trains together. So conjunctions, right? They're words that link parts of a sentence together. I'm going to go ahead and bring our attention to specifically subordinating conjunctions. And these words connect one important part of a sentence to a less important part. So that's going to be the main difference between a subordinating conjunction and a coordinating conjunction. And this less important part of a sentence is called the dependent clause. Okay, so dependent clauses, we know they cannot stand alone because it doesn't make sense without the other part of the sentence. So subordinating conjunctions make one part of the sentence dependent on the other. That's why in our 2 examples, when we had the words although and when at the start of the dependent clause, right, they were then identified as dependent clauses because they had this word, the subordinating conjunction, that then kind of triggered us as readers to think, there has to be further information. Yet there was no further information, so that clause on its own, right, could not stand as a sentence that is grammatically correct on its own. So subordinating conjunctions, they are words that kind of link together 2 parts of a sentence, and they are used with dependent clauses. So the less important part of a sentence, or more so just the clause that needs further information and relies on an independent clause. So that's what a subordinating conjunction is. And using this knowledge that dependent clauses require the subordinating conjunction, I want us to go ahead and please write one independent clause on your own. So that is a clause that can stand on its own. It has a subject and a verb, and it makes sense to grammatically be a sentence on its own. And then I also want you to write one dependent clause on your own. If you think back, right, that is a clause that cannot stand on its own, and it typically has the subordinating conjunction kind of right at the start. So if that'll help you, right, subordinating conjunctions should start the dependent clause. All right. I'm moving on from there, and we are now going to bring our attention to coordinating conjunctions. So coordinating conjunctions are a little bit different than subordinating conjunctions because coordinating conjunctions connect things that are equal, sentence parts that are equal. Okay, so you use them to join two similar parts of a sentence, like two complete thoughts, two ideas, or two words, right? Excuse me. So coordinating conjunctions have an equal part on either side of them, whereas a dependent clause requires a subordinating conjunction because that dependent clause is of lesser value than an independent clause is. So that is the main difference. Our coordinating conjunctions can be seen as fanboys, if you've ever heard of this acronym. So for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. Right? You put a comma in front of each of the coordinating conjunctions, and a good way to remember them is just by fanboys remembering those. So these are all of our coordinating conjunctions, and they link two equal parts. Subordinating versus coordinating, right? As I mentioned, and I'll continue to kind of just say, coordinating conjunctions join grammatically equal elements, while subordinating conjunctions join clauses together to show a relationship between them. So that's the difference. It's in the equality and which sort of clauses are being used for each. Knowing this, I want us to kind of think about how sentences should be written grammatically. So I want us to combine clauses to create the following compound sentence structure. So one of the grammatically correct formulas you can use in order to create a compound sentence is an independent clause, comma, a coordinating conjunction, which is a fanboy, and then an independent clause. If you recall, coordinating conjunctions link two equal parts, right? So that's why it has to be independent clause, coordinating conjunction, independent clause. It cannot be one independent, one dependent. That will not work with coordinating conjunctions. So, Romeo is in love with Juliet. She is the daughter of his family's enemy. As you can see, we have two equal sentences. Both of them are independent clauses. So when we put the fanboy or the coordinating conjunction but in there to combine the two sentences, that makes sense. That works because it's two equal parts, okay? Two equal parts. You have the comma, you have the fanboy, and perfect. It looks grammatically correct, and that is a nice compound sentence, okay? So fanboys, right? They require commas in front when we're making these compound sentences, but it's also important to know that not every single time that you see a word that is a fanboy will you have to have that comma, right? So if we're looking at this next thing, it's asking, does this need a comma before or? And so scientists are creating material that self-destructs or breaks down for reuse on command, okay? So scientists are creating material that self-destructs or breaks down for reuse on command. We do not need a comma in front of this or, simply because it's not an independent clause. Coordinating conjunctions, when they function as that and kind of connect the two independent clauses, that's when you're going to need the comma before. However, when we're just connecting two words or two phrases, right, that are not full on equal parts on either half of the conjunction, you will not need a comma. So that is just a good tip to remember, because I think a common grammatical mistake is just always getting in the habit of using a comma before a fanboy or a word that is a fanboy. and that sometimes creates grammatical errors in your writing. So when we are looking at compound sentences and we use a coordinating conjunction, we need to put a comma. However, every single time that we necessarily use that word doesn't mean that we have to always use a comma. We have to look at it with a critical lens and think about the bigger picture. Is there an independent clause on one side, and is there also that independent clause on the other side? So here's some sentence structure practice. We just looked at independent clauses, comma, coordinating conjunction, independent clause. Those are compound sentences. Here we have some complex sentences, and these are the two structures we need to know. So we have a dependent clause, comma, independent clause, and then we have an independent clause, dependent clause without a comma. So we can connect two independent clauses using a coordinating conjunction, or in this instance, these dependent clauses are going to have a subordinating conjunction, and depending on the order, will determine on if we need to use a comma or not. So here we have a sentence or several sentences that we need to kind of fix grammatically using our knowledge on complex sentences now. So the city expanded the subway system because rush hour traffic was a problem. When people take the subway, it is also better for the environment. Our answers are, our answers are the city expanded the subway system because rush hour traffic was a problem. If you look right here, there is no comma anymore. There does not need to be a comma before because it is not a fanboy, okay? Because is a subordinating conjunction. So right here, because rush hour traffic was a problem, that's a dependent clause. And if we look right here, this is an independent clause. So the city expanded the subway system. That could be a period on its own and it would be grammatically correct, okay? So because we have an independent clause that then has a dependent clause that follows, there's no comma, and we are looking at that ID sentence structure. The following one is when people take the subway, comma, it is also better for the environment. And that is because we start with that dependent clause. If we look at the subordinating conjunction, right, when people take the subway, it then has to have a comma, which then introduces that independent clause. So these are just sentences. They're complex sentences, and it's a structure that we kind of have to memorize and know in order to figure out when we need to use commas and make a sentence grammatically correct. So what I want us to do, we looked at these three different sentence structures, compound sentences and complex sentences, and here are the different formulas, right? We have an independent clause, coordinating conjunction, independent clause. We have a dependent clause, comma, independent clause. And then we also have an independent clause, dependent clause without a comma. I want you on your own to write one sentence for each of these different formulas. All right, here we have some further information. So correct the run-on sentence below using proper punctuation. If you want to go ahead and pause the video and see if you can do it on your own before I show you the answers. Here we have the answers though. So never stand up in a rowboat or canoe, period, right? That we need to kind of just end it there because we don't have a coordinating conjunction that follows, and this is not a dependent clause that follows either. So never stand up in a rowboat or canoe, period. It is likely to capsize, period. If it does capsize, dependent clause, stay with the boat, period. Okay, so do not try to swim to shore. It may be farther away than you think. Right here, we have something new that we haven't gone over yet in this lesson, and that is the semicolon. So this is going to be our final sentence structure we're going to learn in this sentence structure review. And the semicolon connects two independent clauses together. They can function in the same way that a regular period would function. So it could also be grammatically correct to do not try to swim to shore, period. It may be farther away than you think, period. Okay, so semicolons are interesting in the way that they kind of function in the exact same way as a period would. However, when two independent clauses are closely connected but don't rely on one another, sometimes a semicolon can be a more impressive way to connect these two sentences or two independent clauses. So semicolons, we use a semicolon to separate two or more complete sentences whose ideas are related. Once again, as I just mentioned, right? They are independent clauses, they are related, but they do not rely on one another. We also use semicolons to separate a complicated series of phrases that contain commas. If we look right here, 3 reading response papers, a lit review, and a research paper, 2 presentations, 1 group, and 1 individual, right? We have this big list of items. Sometimes it makes more sense to use a semicolon so that way you don't get something that's called a comma splice, okay? So sometimes semicolons are needed to separate these longer lists and series of items. So that's what a semicolon is. And I want us to now correct the sentences below for semicolon errors. So, it's raining outside. I will bring my umbrella with me. Where do we think we could possibly put a semicolon? And then let's also look at the second one. Hopefully, the weather will change soon. Otherwise, the whole summer will go by without the sun shining. So here we have our answers, right? It's raining outside. That could be a period that follows, or since they are connected independent clauses, and semicolon is going to make a little bit more sense here and also be more grammatically impressive to your reader. The second one, hopefully the weather will change soon, semicolon. Otherwise, the whole summer will go by without the sun shining. Here we have that comma splice that would occur, but also we have independent clauses that are able to be connected. So hopefully the weather will change soon, semicolon. Otherwise, the weather will go by without the sun shining. That is our semicolon practice. What I want us to do, we have one last practice, and that is Diana doesn't understand algebra. Therefore, she will probably not pass the math final. And she never enjoyed math, so she might not major in it in college. I want us to think critically right here on your own. Go ahead, make those corrections before I share on the screen what the final answers are. And they are as follows, right? The first one, we need that semicolon before therefore. But in the second one, here we have a fan voice, so we have to put a comma, coordinating conjunction, independent clause, right? This makes it so that this cannot be two independent clauses that are connected by a semicolon. Rather, the comma makes more sense there. All right. So on your own, try writing a sentence effectively using a semicolon, right? So those are those two independent clauses that are connected by a semicolon. And to kind of end our review, right, we have learned our 4 different terms: dependent clauses, independent clauses, subordinating conjunctions, and coordinating conjunctions. And we also learned compound and complex sentence structures. If you have any questions, right, your teachers are always able to help you. And yes, thank you very much. I hope you learned something new.